Newgrange, I was just, before I leave Stonehenge, I mean, there has been a lot of speculation that it was used for other things too. Extreme rising and setting positions of the moon, and even rising and setting positions of the stars. But this is highly speculative. It's just that the solar alignment seems to be too much to be a coincidence. I mean, it almost looks like it's really the central feature of the whole structure. As many writers have pointed out, if you have enough stones and enough targets in the sky, you can make all sorts of claims. But again, was any of this part of the actual motivation of building it? And for everything else except for the solar alignment, it's really just highly speculative. Newgrange in Ireland is an equally intriguing structure. Here you can see it's sort of a low, very wide but very shallow mound, perhaps about a dozen meters high but about 80 meters across. It wasn't in very good shape when archaeologists started to work on it in the 1960s, but they have fixed it up, and it's thought to be quite authentic. So it's thought to look very much today as it did 5,000 years ago when it was built. It is a burial chamber. There's an entranceway here. There's a stone that was blocking the entrance. It has been pulled back from the entrance so visitors can go in. And above the main door, there's this unusual feature here called the roof box. And you'll see the significance of that in a moment. So as with Stonehenge, there was an alignment here that involves the rising sun, this time on the winter solstice. And it turns out that on the winter solstice, just as the sun rises, and only for a few moments, sunlight passes through this roof box along this entrance chamber. Here it is in overhead, here it is in a side view, and briefly illuminates this rear chamber. It's not totally clear what it was used for. There were some human remains found here. At the same time, it's thought that it was a very privileged or exclusive place. So these may have been the bodies of chieftains or some important people in the community, and perhaps it was considered sacred. This would also perhaps explain why the entrance was blocked off at a certain point. Again, we don't know exactly what they were thinking, but it does seem to be not a coincidence that the entire structure is aligned with the place where the sun rises on the winter solstice. And in fact, of course, you can, oh, that's great, thanks. And you can see this today. The government department in Ireland that looks after it has a lottery. You can put your name in through the internet, and they take, but the thing is, they only take 20 people into the chamber on each of the, I think, 10 days, like 5 days before the solstice and 5 days after the solstice. And whereas thousands and thousands of people put their name in the lottery. So anyway, I wasn't there on the solstice. I was there, I think, in May, but it was still quite interesting. It's a very unique, remarkable place, and certainly a lot less well-known than Stonehenge, but equally intriguing. Now, in more modern times, we've been very good at measuring time very precisely and building tools and machines that are specifically designed in order to do that. Oh, is this the remote thingy? Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to, I'll try that backwards. Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Good. Will the central one do like the laser? Okay. Now what's brighter, that one or mine? Oh, they're about the same. All right, you can have a contrast later. Okay, thanks, Ingrid. So, it's interesting, sundials go back at least to ancient Egypt, and by the time of ancient Roman civilization, they were commonplace. One of my favorite quotations is from a Roman playwright named Plautus, who was kind of complaining about how there were sundials everywhere, all over, you know, the marketplace and the town square, and he was really feeling a certain angst that his life felt so rushed and hurried now that there were sundials everywhere. He was kind of complaining about it. So I don't know if any of you have ever felt rushed or hurried, but if you have had that feeling, you're not the first one to have had it. Mechanical clocks arrived or appeared in Europe in about the well, give or take 1300, give or take a couple of decades. That central photo is the clock in Salisbury Cathedral in England, and you can see it today. It's just sitting there. It's been sort of fixed up over the years, but it runs, and it runs more or less just as it would have done more than 6 centuries ago, 7 centuries ago. These machines, of course, mimic the motion of the sun across the sky. In the case of the sundial, it's actually very literal, right? As the sun moves across the sky, the shadow of the gnomon, that's this pointy thing here, moves in the opposite direction. Mechanical clocks have, of course, an advantage over the sundial, obviously, because they can work even when it's cloudy and they can work at night. And as long as you keep winding them up, they keep going. Actually, the Chinese had mechanical clocks, perhaps a couple of centuries earlier. They were slightly different. They were still mechanical clocks, but they were water-driven, whereas these European clocks are weight-driven. And, I mean, both are, fine. Water, of course, if the water freezes, then you're in trouble. But a weight-driven clock, as long as you remember to wind it, which you do have to do, it'll just keep going in perpetuity. So, I think some interesting psychological changes start to happen. This is sort of me speculating, but as these clocks become commonplace, I think we start to think of time in a new way. We start to think of time as this sort of eternally passing thing, and that's the reason I wanted to have the stick here. Now, I realize that yardsticks and meter sticks measure space and not time, but there is kind of a parallel, which is that we start to think, I would argue, of time as being this entity, this sort of linear thing, and I like to have a red arrow, which I call the arrow of now. You should all have one. And, you could just imagine, it doesn't sit still, right? So it's different from space. The moment that we call now keeps changing, and as soon as you say it, it's already in the past, and another moment has come to take its place. I know that's all very sort of obvious, but it's a bit interesting to think about, well, first of all, if you think of time that way. I don't know for sure that you do, but if you do think of time passing in that way, why do you think of time in passing that way? So maybe it is related to having spent the last 600 or 700 years staring at clocks. After all, if you could bend the meter stick, and with the tape measure you can actually do it, bend it around into a circle, of course, then it is a clock. They're basically the same thing. So I think this kind of idea is in the air when Newton comes along and writes his famous book, The Principia, and it's an interesting book. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure, have at least, well, you've heard of it, and I don't know if you've had the misfortune of having tried to read it or anything, but I've read bits of it in English, not in Latin, believe me. But it's a funny sort of book. Towards the beginning he says, well, I don't have to define space and time because these are well known to everyone, but then he defines them anyway. I guess just he felt that he had to. So he gives this interesting definition of time. He says that absolute, true, and mathematical time, in and of itself, of its own nature, without reference to anything external, flows uniformly. So here we have a couple of interesting words. Flow is going to sort of come back to haunt us a little bit. But he does say it flows uniformly. This is something, he's trying to contrast this pure, absolute, true mathematical time with what he calls the common time. The time that we just saw in this picture here. The common time, as you might read it from a sundial or a mechanical clock, all these devices are imperfect. The mechanical clocks in Newton's day were not very good. They could gain or lose 10 or 15 minutes a day quite easily. So no one considered them to be that reliable. You'd have to set them against a sundial. And you can say to yourself, well, okay, but at least the sundial is perfect. But no, not really. I mean, what we want to keep track of is mean solar time, the time that a sundial would keep if the sun moved at the same rate throughout the year, which it doesn't. And the astronomers here will know a bit about why that's the case. And when I give my RIC talks, I sometimes go into a bit more detail. I'll leave it at that for now. But the point is that even a sundial doesn't track the hours in a uniform way. It's really anything.